Hello and welcome back to the Pembrokeshire Pilgrimage. This is the second day, and gosh do we have a lot in store. First of all, we encounter some incredible funeral monuments, then we view the gorgeous lily eggs at Bosherton before I get flummoxed by the size of this board. Not as big as I thought it was going to be. I was expecting. After that, we come across some tanks which have an interesting connection to one of the churches. Then finally I get scared by some cows and have to beg a farmer to help me. But of course all of this is taking place in the gorgeous Welsh countryside on our pilgrimage, which is guided by these stunning medieval churches. And this is the first church. This is Stackpole Church. It's dedicated to St Illidir. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but maybe. That saint isn't really actually a real saint. It could just be the name of the founder, which is Illidir, or it could be a variation of Telio. I think I'm pronouncing that right, who was a well-known, quite common saint to be dedicated to across Wales in the medieval period. Stackpole is really well known for its monument. It's got a great collection of monuments. There's now just a lot of tractors going by. Anyway, yes, there's loads of monuments inside, and we'll go and explore those now. It's worth bearing in mind that the church has a medieval tower, a late medieval tower, very similar to the one we saw at Hodgeston yesterday. And the main body of the church was basically almost entirely rebuilt in the 19th century. That's because the church was patronised by the Earls of Cador, who lived at Stackpole Court, which unfortunately was demolished in the 1960s. The first of the stunning monuments here at Stackpole is this 14th century effigy of a knight. It's believed to be Richard de Stackpole. Tradition has it that it was a Crusader monument because it's got crossed legs, although this tradition was invented in the 17th century. It is purely just fashion. It's not got anything to do with them having taken a vow to go to the Holy Land, as people have thought for centuries, really. It's a gorgeous example of decorated Gothic architecture. And as with the monument opposite that we'll look at in a moment, it's got these incredible surviving carvings of mourners. You know, they are secular, hence why they haven't really been attacked. But these are quite a rare survival. Also, it's got this wonderful canopy in the decorated Gothic architectural style, similar to what we saw at Hodgeston yesterday. Then on the other side of the chancel we have this stunning monument of a medieval lady, probably, I think I remember reading that it was the wife of Richard de Stackpole, but I can't validate that as there's no internet here and I can't find a guidebook. But it's a gorgeous, I would guess, probably 14th century, given the similar decorated Gothic ornamentation, the wallflowers at the bottom, string horse, and then the highly decorative spandrels on those arches. She's got this beautiful headdress on. She's got these two weepers, although I believe these weepers probably to be Victorian imitations of what was once there as medieval carvings that probably got damaged or deliberately attacked during the Reformation. And on the other side of this Victorian screen, we have the Lord Chapel. The Lords were the Lords of the Manor. I believe it went from the Stackpoles, then the Lords, and then to the Earls of Cador. But we'll get on to them in a minute. So here we are in the Lord Chapel. It's this little side chapel to the altar, probably built in the 14th century. It's got these gorgeous, heavy rib vaults. I assume it was intended to the purpose to be a chantry chapel, probably to these two people here, although I believe their identity is unknown, probably the Stackpoles, one would reckon, but there's heavily worn effigies. You know, there's almost no facial features to them, but you can work out obviously their hands in prayer and then the sort of lines of their robes. So this chapel is really cluttered full of monuments. Here we have a monument to the Lort family. Roger Lort died in 1613, this gentleman. It's a rather crude monument for its period, you know. It's very reminiscent of what you probably see in the West Country. In fact, it could well have come from the West Country, as you know, not from here. It's a short boat ride across to Cornwall, Devon, Somerset. So we're looking at something that probably isn't from around here. Yes, as you see, you know, look at his face, there's rather cartoonish and sort of wonky eyes and all that. I don't think this is Victorian painting over, but it well could have been. They often did that, but they usually wouldn't have left so much of it blank. But it's got these really lovely, I really love these Ionic columns, classical columns. It's a really splendid monument, and at the foot of the monument here, we have the dozens of children, but several children, females on one side, males on the other, praying at the prayer desk. Classic post-Reformation monument here. And then moving through to the 18th and 19th centuries, we've got a final Lort monument here on the wall in beautiful marble in classic sort of 18th century traditional sort of neoclassical Barockish style. It was the Lorts that married into the Cador family, the Campbells of Cador, who were earls up in Scotland. There's Cador Castle right on the Murray Firth in the northeast of Scotland, and the Campbells, of course, being one of the most powerful and famous clans in Scottish history. So it's a bit of a surprise to actually find them buried here, but they inherited this estate, and obviously perhaps it's better well connected, you know, more prosperous, nicer place to live maybe than the right north of Scotland. So they moved here and they're buried here. So this is the Earl of Cador, who restored this church in the mid-19th century. He got Sir George Gilbert Scott, the finest of Britain's architects during that day, you know, built the likes of Glasgow University and St Mary's Cathedral in Edinburgh, beautiful Gothic Revival buildings. But yes, he was employed by the Earl to restore the church. It's almost entirely rebuilt. There is almost very little medieval fabric left, apart from, you know, this chapel and the gorgeous tower. But yes, this is a very typical Victorian monument, sort of reminiscent of a medieval monument with, you know, the niches on the chest, the wicker rug he's lying on, and the two weeping angels either side of him. Being a Victorian, or largely Victorian church, all the windows are filled with stained glass, and there are very few windows, so it's a very dark church. I have turned the light on, but it's not making much difference. In this transept here, we have a stained glass window which was given by the people of the local parishes. Most of the churches we'll go to today, so here, Stackpole, Bosherton, St Twiniel's, I believe, and Castlemartin, who gave money to raise the window in memory of the Earl, who rebuilt all of those churches in the mid-19th century. I believe is it King David building the temple? And therefore, you know, creating the associations between David and the Earl. And then on the right-hand side here, we have a monument to another one of the Campbells of Cador. This one died during the Zulu Wars, something you wouldn't expect to find here in rural Wales. But here I am just outside the church. As you see, it's very Victorian. Apparently the lynch gate to my right is an Art Nouveau lynch gate, not many of those, and was designed by the same man who designed Cairo Museum. I think he was a relation of the Cadors. But also, finally, worth noting about something inside the church is this rather strange little stone near the font. This is a medieval depiction of the temptation. You've got Adam and Eve in the garden. Obviously, she eats the apple. Then the angel kicks them out of Eden. And then you have toil and pain, Eve and pain and Adam at work. They're quite a rare and incredible survival, which actually belonged to a church not far away from here called St Petrox. However, that's been basically abandoned, and now it's here. I didn't know it was here, so that's a great surprise, a lovely one. So onward with our journey. Today is going to be one of the longest days of the pilgrimage, walking a total distance of about 18 miles. The first section takes us from Freshwater East to Bosherton. So we've walked already through the country lanes down to Stackpole Church. Now it's time to head down through the Stackpole Estate, through the beautiful forests and lily lakes to the Bosherton village, where I'll rejoin you at the church. But please enjoy this short little montage of the countryside and managed estate. This is a really good example of nature reclaiming, you know, what it once was it. So here is like a quay almost for the boating lake, and the boating lake is just covered in like reeds. And then up here, this at the top of this bank, I think these are the walled gardens, and I think the house was up there. I'm not sure whether to go up there or keep going straight. So I decided to go up, and that was the right decision, because look at that view, lovely. You've got the, is it 7, 8 or 9 arch bridges, bridge, sorry, it's got so many arches, can't remember how many, but many. I'm assuming these are ornamental lakes, these aren't naturally occurring. Probably created the 18th or 19th centuries. But let's keep going up and see what we find. So I was slightly mistaken in the fact that those walls were not the walls of the walled garden, but were in fact the sort of base of the house. The flat level plain behind me there is where the house would have stood. I unfortunately was rambling about this up the top here, but you can't hear what I'm saying because the wind is just too strong. But anyway, the history of Stackpole Court dates really from the 18th century onwards, as when the Campbells acquired the estate, they rebuilt the house. The medieval house disappeared in the mid-18th century, when the Campbells created a Palladian-style mansion, and all that's left of this grand house are the outbuildings. The Palladian mansion was rebuilt in the 19th century when the Campbells became earls, and here we see some delightful old photographs from before its destruction. But the fate of the house really was sealed in the 1930s when the government requisitioned part of the estate to create the Castlemartin firing range, which we will encounter slightly later. But yes, then in the Second World War, the house was used as an officer's mess, and after the war, the lead from the roof was stolen, meaning the house fell into a bad state of disrepair. So, unfortunately, in the 1960s, after failing to get a grant to turn the house into a smaller mansion, the 6th Earl decided to have the house demolished. And then in 1976, the house was given to the National Trust, who have managed the estate ever since. So immediately as you come through the door is the most interesting, or one of the most interesting features inside this church. It's the table of kindred and affinity. Now this is essentially a table telling you who you can and who you cannot marry. Well, particularly what relatives you cannot marry. So for example, the first one here is a man may not marry his grandmother. Seems fairly obvious, but they felt it was a necessity to state this, as these are the church laws. But in the 19th century, they also made civil law. Often people would find out after being married that their marriage was void because it violated the rules of the church, and in the case of later 19th century, the rules of civil law. These are particularly pertinent inside rural churches. We're quite rural here in Bosherton, not very many population centres around here apart from Pembroke up the road. So these are very important to keep people from, committing incest basically. What's also interesting about the table is that in the middle it shows you the references, as in they're all Leviticus, or there is one Corinthians I spot, but they're all Leviticus, and it's telling you, this is, if you want evidence of where this is, go and look it up in the Bible, which is the Protestant tradition. Have your sources. Ad fontes is the Latin name for that, what the humanists who you could argue started the Reformation and definitely carried it, they go always back to the sources, ad fontes, and that's what this board is showing. We also have on the left-hand side here the plain statement of the marriage laws of the Church of England, and you're like, hang on a minute, this is Wales, but obviously before the early 20th century, the Church of England was the church in Wales. It was the official establishment church, and it was disestablished in the early 20th century. Quite an interesting little feature, although I must say actually, it's not as big as I thought it was going to be. I was expecting a large table, but I think some other ones are quite large, but this is only a little one. And what's also quite interesting here is you can see that it says published by the Marriage Law Defence Union, 1 King Street, Westminster. So there was people very committed to this, that they set up their own union and were probably posting these out for free, I imagine. Sort of Victorian, sort of, driven by, dubious moral fears, probably. But they were often very good at sort of doing social good. So similar to the church we went to at Stackpole, it's a medieval church that's been heavily restored in the 19th century. I believe all the woodwork, the Minton tiles again in the chancel and sanctuary, this is all the work of the Earl of Cador, who was restoring the churches around here. We already talked about that with the beautiful David window at Stackpole. Okay, so as you can see, the church is a cruciform, and under each of the windows in the north and south transepts are a little alcove with an effigy. The one behind me is a female. She's got a hedge dress, a lovely like niche above her, and she's dressed in lovely cloaks. Supposedly this is the Dowager Duchess of Buckingham, who is an ancestor of the Dukes of Norfolk. But when I ever look this up, I can't really find much on it. It's a bit of a curiosity, but this is sort of one of those things where I think churches elaborate and make up stuff, if you will. Maybe twist the truth slightly, because I can't find any reason why she would be here in the middle of nowhere in Wales. Yes, she may have been a very powerful and noble figure, but it doesn't seem she had any connection to the Stackpole Estate. She was, a Neville. If this is the 15th century Neville, Dowager Duchess of Buckingham, then she's a Neville, so her power base, her traditional family would have been in the north of England. So it just doesn't add up, but it's a beautiful effigy. And then the one on the other side, it's just like in Stackpole, supposedly a crusader, although this one doesn't have its legs crossed. I think that's, again, a little elaboration to make people more interested, which I've not got a problem with, because it's great if someone comes because they think, oh, this is the Dowager Duchess, or this is the crusader, but it's, I don't know, it's not historically accurate, and it feels a bit untrue to say.
So it was now time to leave Bosherton Church and head off on the second half of today's journey. First of all, we walked through the beautiful village of Bosherton with its quaint houses. I loved this one having tile slates on the walls. Then we headed up out of the village along the footpath that snakes its way around the edge of the Castlemartin firing range. We first of all came across a very impressive cavernous former quarry before taking these quiet little country lanes through round the edge of the Castlemartin firing range, and then we work our way up past Merrion Camp to Warren, and finally ending up in Castlemartin. But I'll rejoin you as I approach the edge of the firing range.
So we're up on the perimeter of the Castlemartin range now, and I was expecting it to have, 6-metre high fences, but instead there are literally just signs saying don't walk over there because it may explode and you may be killed. Great. But what's lovely is they've allowed this edge of the range to be used as sort of a wild nature reserve. It's, as you see, it's very beautiful, luscious green overgrowth, and apparently this is a haven for nature, as obviously the UK's lost an incredible amount of its, probably like 80-90% I think, of its like wildflower meadows since the Second World War. Like heavy agriculture basically predominates the UK landscape, and so we don't have much of stuff like this anymore, and that means apparently a specific type of bumblebee lives here, and only 6 other places in the whole of Britain. That's just a fence. So that's quite incredible, really. You can understand why. There's just miles and miles of this heathland that obviously they do use for, firing shells into, but maybe not anymore, because obviously not only has the UK lost incredible amounts of its natural reserves, if you will, the army has lost its reserves, as the UK army is the smallest it's been since the Napoleonic Wars. This is much more what I expected to be walking along the whole way, but just by the military housing. That makes sense, but yeah, I'm glad it wasn't all like this. I was hoping to see one of these earlier, a massive tank coming out of the bushes, but no, we get the static ones at the front, as always. Here we are at Warren Church, almost at Castlemartin. It was quite a drag up the Castlemartin firing range at the end, but I finally made it here, had some lovely lunch, and toasted some Canadian people. The church is quite interesting, actually. It's got a well in it. I've not seen that as in not like a holy well, more like a dug-out well. The tower is just huge. It's one of these great big medieval towers that they have around here that we've already seen at almost every church we've been to. But then it's got that huge spire on it. There are not many churches have spires around here. That spire dates to the 19th century. It's not an original feature. It was in the mid-19th century, the 1850s, I believe, when there was fears that the French were going to invade. So the Navy, to help them easily navigate, put the spire on the church because Milford Haven was an important Navy dockyard. It brings to mind some examples in my native Suffolk where King William of Orange made it mandatory that for the local population who didn't need the big churches that they'd built in the medieval period anymore, to not knock down the towers, to keep them as landmarks for the Navy, as in those days the main naval base was Great Yarmouth. So here we are inside Warren Church. As you can see, the church was another of these churches restored in the 19th century by the Earl of Cador. You've got those Minton tiles beautifully tessellating here, more visible here than in the other churches, I'd say. We've got so many interesting features here, but the one I have to mention first, the organ. This was made in the mid-19th century, 1840s, for the composer Mendelssohn, a great, I believe he was German, I could be mistaken, who fell in love with Britain. I know he wrote a Scottish symphony, but I'm not an expert on classical music. I'm sure someone in the comments can give me more details on that. It's a stunning organ. It's got these two Corinthian pilasters either side of it. It's quite a small one. It's more of the portal organ type. And it's certainly been portable because it's been moved all over the place. So I don't know where it originally was, but it ended up in Sibton Church in Suffolk. That's literally on the other side of the country to here. And then it was brought not to this church, but to the neighbouring Castlemartin church. That's one I'm going to visit next. And that church is now no longer used. It's in the care of the Friends of Friendless Churches. So it was then brought here. It was given here by the people of Castlemartin for the church here and has since been restored with money from the German army. Talking of the German army, I bet few churches in the world, let alone in Britain, have the German army's Iron Cross on them. That's because this altar, along with the little lid on the font, were produced by German soldiers in the NATO army training camp in Bergen. This is, I believe, probably just after the war. And so the altar here, not only does it have the Duke of Bohemia's 3 feathers that the Prince of Wales, the Black Prince, I believe, then stole from him, and since then it's become the symbol of the Prince of Wales. So King Charles, when he was a Prince of Wales, this was his emblem. And it not only has that British symbol, but it also has the international NATO symbol on the side of it, and then on the other side, that German Army cross. I think this is a very highly unusual altar. Also next to Mendelssohn's organ is this small lancet window. The stained glass in it dates to the 1920s, and we can tell it was produced by Powell as it has the small hooded robed figure, a monk, a white friar, as the Powell family brought out the friary glassworks in the mid-19th century, and then they flourished. You see lots of bright heraldic glass produced by Powell's in the 1920s in commemoration of those who've fallen during the war, as is the case with this one. But I love how you can identify the stained glass just through a tiny little emblem. It's a bit like Mason's marks, but we actually sort of know exactly who that refers to. This is possibly one of the weirdest roundabouts I've ever seen. Look at that. It's just a complete roundabout made of stone. That's because that wasn't originally a roundabout. Obviously today that's its purpose. It was originally the village pound, which is where if stray cattle got loose, then they would be taken and kept in there. And then if you owned that cattle, you'd have to pay a fine. So that's quite interesting, isn't it? But this is in the village of Castlemartin. We're now about to approach the church in, I don't know, 10 minutes maybe. So here we are, we finally made it to Castlemartin, the end of the second day of the Pembrokeshire Pilgrimage. As you see, this is a beautiful little church. It's in a secluded little area. It's surrounded by prehistoric earthen banks. The tower is again the most prominent feature, very similar to the ones we've already seen, although I think this one's slightly different. It sort of tapers in a bit more quickly and comes from a larger sort of square base. It also apparently used to have a saddleback roof, which would have made it very different from the other ones. Again, like the churches we've seen today, it was restored in the mid-19th century. However, before we go inside, I think we should just pay attention to these two features that greet you as you come and see the church for the first time. On the right here, or on my right I should say, we have, well, it's a kind of weird thing these days, but these were quite common once upon a time, mounting on blocks. So you would walk up these, and then mount on your horse. Makes pretty self-explanatory. I don't know how old these ones are. Quite common to see them from the 18th century, I believe. And then we have the porch. Not the porch, that's not a porch, that's a lynch gate. So the gates to the churchyard here are also really interesting. They were produced in the late 19th century by a company called J&A Stevens, a local company. The elder Stevens, called Naki Stevens, he was the blacksmith in the village here. And then he set up a company and they produced all sorts of things, starting off as agricultural produce, not produce, but agricultural machinery, and then going into all sorts of stuff, steamrollers, submarines, not submarines, but things for submarines. And they produced these gates for the church. These gates have that wonderful little feature. They are the hands thought to be a cast of the younger Mr. Stevens' son, a 5-year-old boy. They're his hands, apparently, from the late 19th century. That's really incredible. The gates are also thought to be a copy of the gates at Sandringham Church. Apparently they have also little hands. I don't know if they're royal hands, considering it's the royal church on the royal estate in Norfolk. So I'm slightly losing the will to live here on the end of my second day of the Pembrokeshire Pilgrimage, as I'm going a little bit doolally about keeping order of what I'm speaking about and what videos I'm making. But here we are inside the church here at Castlemartin. It's again restored by the Earl of Cador. If I say that again, I think I'll go insane, but thankfully I don't think I have to. Obviously we've got the lovely Minton tiles. They seem to be different in each church, which is quite nice. The church here is quite simple. It's also very dark because it's full of Victorian stained glass, like the one behind me in the east window. That's even more dark because there is a tree growing right outside of it. But this window dates to the late 19th century, I think, and was given in memory of the Lieutenant Colonel Lambton and his wife Victoria. His wife Victoria was a goddaughter of Queen Victoria, right, alongside, you know, foreign royals and dignitaries. In the window, which was produced by Heaton, Butler and Bain, you can see a little castle. That is supposed to be Balmoral Castle, therefore an ode to her godmother. It was given by the people of the parish to those two individuals in memory of them, who lived at Brownslade Farm, not far from here. The church itself is a lovely medieval structure. You've got a 13th century early Gothic north aisle. You've got that later medieval tower, which we've already spoken about, with its saddle-backed roof. A lot of the woodwork is 19th century. We've got a beautiful 12th century tub font that they believe came from Somerset. The stone isn't quarried around here, and it was shipped across the sea to Pembrokeshire. One of the many things I love about these Welsh churches that I'm getting used to exploring now is these funny little squints that exist in the churches. This, I assume, was to allow more people to see the altar, as often, obviously, in earlier medieval churches, you just have the solid chancel arch and not many people can see through, and that's not the point. But then I guess as they expanded, this north aisle dates to the 13th century. This was to allow the people in the aisle to actually see through, just like those people, or some of the people in the nave could. I saw this in other churches where they were transept churches, that they had these squints to allow those sitting in the transept to see through to the altar. What's quite interesting about the north aisle here at Castlemartin is a small little face carved into the top of the capital. Well, it's more of a corbel, not a capital. Here, behind me, it is a death-like face, and they believe it to be a face of protection, because the north side of the church is, of course, the dark side of the church, because the sun goes round the south. And so they thought that the north side was the dark, devil's side of the church. And so this face is to protect the church and the high altar from the dark forces. So if you climb up one of the really steep earthen banks, they say they're prehistoric, that surround the church, you come up here to the ruins of what is an old vicarage. But what makes this really special is that arcade in the background. You see, it's very similar to the one inside the church, however those faces are slightly different. It's unknown how old it is. It could date to the 12th century. Some people say it's pre-conquest, meaning it could be 10th century or older. It would make it a very old building indeed. Sadly, the churchyard is sort of overgrown around the vicarage. As you see, it's full of nettles and ivy pulling it down probably eventually. Here we are right at the top of the churchyard. This is one of those prehistoric earthen banks. You can see really how sunken the church is into the landscape from here. You can also see the situation of the old vicarage on the left-hand side, on my left-hand side. And I just wanted to say thank you for making it to the end of a second part of the Pembrokeshire Pilgrimage. It's been so wonderful that to have your support along the way. I really hope that you do consider supporting the Friends of Friendless Churches in their efforts to save historic buildings just like this one across England and Wales. They couldn't do it without your help, and as I said in the last video, there is a generous benefactor who's given them, or promised to give them, £500,000 if they can raise an additional £500,000. So for every pound you give, it will be doubled. You donate £1, he donates £1, or they, more rather, I don't know the gender. So every single penny counts, and with that you can rescue so many more buildings that are facing dereliction across our country. Okay, so we're coming to the campsite at the end of day 2, but the campsite is up on the top of the hill and there is 1,000 cows behind me. I met a lovely farmer. He showed me on the map where to go. He had a smooth accent, it was beautiful. And he is going to show me, you know, if I can't get through, he's going to come and take me there himself. It's fine. Excellent. Well, this might be the most ridiculous thing to ever happen to me. I've just had to cross this field full of cows. Thankfully, this lovely farmer helped me get across. He's got a beautiful Welsh accent, and he helped me get across the field. I thought these, I don't know what heifers are, you see. I thought heifers were young men, but no, they're young ladies. So I thought they were chasing me, and I was shouting at them. But no, they weren't coming to chase me at all. So I've just made myself look like a right English little pansy in front of a strong, big Welshman.
So unfortunately, the audio only got worse from here on in. So I'll just explain to you what I'm trying to say in the moment. And what I was saying is that in my haste to escape these cows, well, heifers, that I got myself electrocuted by an electric fence. So that added to the experience. But this was part of the trip where I was like, this is real memory-making moments, as I will never forget the help of the farmer at Castlemartin and the calamity that was my journey onwards from the church. But as I climbed up away from this cow field, you were able to see what really was the issue. Is all of these dikes where you can see those hedgerows there are watery ditches, so it was impossible. I had to go, there was no way through except from through the cow field. But as I climbed up, the view kept getting better, and I think few people probably view Castlemartin from that specific angle. But then we see the Pembroke oil refinery, which is where we'll go tomorrow, and then I got to relax in my campsite and watch this beautiful sunset. So the next episode, which will hopefully be out next week, takes us to Pembroke itself, which is a stunning castle with so much history. But also you get my usual ramblings as I walk through random fields, and we get to visit some wonderful churches such as Ross Crowder in the base of that oil refinery, and I become the Sherlock Holmes of churches and try to figure out why the churches in Pembroke are all in a state of disrepair. But that's all for this episode, and I hope to see you in the next. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed, and do make sure to hit the subscribe and bell icon.